Very good. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm very happy as a chair of the Minorities in Economics Committee of the European Economic Association to start this event in celebration of the first winners of the first paper award on the topic of that is basically or one of the topics covered by the Minorities in Economics Initiative. This particular paper that won the 2022 award, awarded last August, will tell us something quite important on how minorities underrepresentation in US cities can in fact be triggered by institutional reforms. And so it tells us both about what would be desirable policies that would reduce the discrimination of some minorities, in particular in this case, in the race and ethnicity field, but also tells us something about some potential unforeseen consequences, or maybe they were foreseen. We'll learn about that as well. So the way in which this recorded event works is that we are going to have Federico, the younger of the two very productive and
not by much.
Not by much, exactly. You are young too. So Francesco obviously contests my statement. He wants to be portrayed as equal age of Federico. But anyway, they're gonna present in whatever way they want in terms of interaction. In 15 or 20 minutes, their essential component, their motivation, their main results, and whatever they want to tell us to actually help in inspiring other researchers to submit more papers for problems of discrimination, maybe not only in terms of the race and ethnicity dimension, but also in the future more and more on the LGBTQ issues, disabilities, and whatever minority representation issues people are feeling that it would be important to make follow with particularly good research. This is good research no matter what, as you will see, but it's also important for the EEA to push people to work more on issues that are very policy relevant, and the issues of diversity and inclusion, as we know, they are all on the priority agendas of many universities and many institutions, and so this is a very timely type of topic. So without further ado, I give the possibility to show the slides to Federico, and we can start.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if Gemma or Massimo can allow me to share. Okay, there we go. Can everybody see the slide? Okay, good. Yeah, I'm gonna try to be fairly quick. We started this project to basically study representation of minorities in US cities, in US city councils of municipalities. And as it turns out, we were actually studying very much the underrepresentation of minorities in city council. So just to give you a brief overview of what we find, we document substantial underrepresentation of non-white minorities, minority voters in city councils. We do find that this underrepresentation compared to their size of the voting age population in municipalities is stronger when minorities account between 55 to 60% of that underlying voting age population. And this underrepresentation is affected by the strategic selection of electoral rules, is consistent with patterns of voter registration, as well as is affected by other institutional features selected by municipalities. And probably one of the most important parts and results of the paper, we show that the removal of Voting Rights Act protection in 2013, following a US Supreme Court ruling in the Shelby County versus Holder case was detrimental for minority representation and registration at the local level. We will have time. I will make sure to have enough time to discuss what happened in Shelby, because I think that's also the most important result and the most important starting point to go forward in this research. We do care about local politics because we know from the political science literature mostly that local politics in the US is profoundly racially and ethnically divided. And second of all, local politics is the entry point in political careers for many elected officials, so that whatever happens at the local level, even though sometimes is somewhat understudied, will have an impact higher up in the levels of government. So we do care quite a lot what happens there. And as in many countries, but also in the US, municipalities are a key supplier of public good, in particular in the realms of education, policing, and infrastructure. And at the same time, US municipalities have an incredibly vast demographic and institutional variation, which makes them a really, really interesting setup to study. And finally, as I mentioned before, we know very little about the effects of this Shelby County ruling in 2013, and especially we know very little about the effects at the local level. Right? There is some research that focuses at the federal level, federal election results, but we know very little at what happened at the local level. And there's a couple of other working papers at the moment that are working on this. I'm probably going to skip the literature for sake of time. We will have probably more time to talk about this later on. Our data, very interestingly, they come from a number of surveys run by the International City County Management Association. They ran these quinquennial surveys. We look at waves from 1981 to 2018. These are representative surveys of US municipalities with a population above 2,500, and they give us a lot of information about the council composition of municipalities in terms of race or ethnicity, as well as a number of main institutional features of these municipalities, whether they have an elected mayor, the size of these councils, how these councils are elected, and other information. We also use voter registration data. Our data come from the voters list online of Aristotle. They cover the universe of US municipalities, and for consistency with the other data, we focus on those above 2,500 inhabitants. These data have some limitations, which led us to develop some specific identification strategies for this paper. Namely, they're based on the universe of registered voters, live universe of registered voters in the US, meaning that we observe people that are registered today, and what we know about them is when they registered. So we can run counts at the municipality level of when people registered, conditional on being registered today. So we have a specific strategy in the paper to get at results for the registration data as well. So here we start by showing what representation or underrepresentation looks like in US municipalities. So here we're plotting on the x-axis, you have the underlying voting age population, minority, meaning non-white voting age population at the municipality level. And on the y-axis, we have the share of council members who belong to a minority. And the line is a simple lowest smoothing of the underlying municipality level data, and the dots are simple averages by bins of population. And there's a couple of things that we get from these pictures, and this is really what started the whole paper, really. And the first one is that minorities are underrepresented throughout the entire spectrum of the population, right? So the line and the dots are consistently below a 45-degree line, which you can see as a normative benchmark of proportionality. And this underrepresentation, this distance from the line is really highest when minorities account for, let's say, 60% of the underlying population in this picture, or in general, at a point in which they theoretically they should be electorally pivotal in an election, if not an outright majority. So we started from this empirical fact, this raw data empirical fact, and we started to analyze it and test it empirically and statistically. So we define underrepresentation as the difference between the population share in the municipality and the share of non-white minority council member. And we run a quadratic specification on the population share. Basically, we're looking for an inverted U shape in underrepresentation, right? Underrepresentation grows up until a certain minority population share, and then starts decreasing. And here is what we find when we run this quadratic specification. So the top panel shows the estimates of this quadratic specification. So we have a strong and consistent concave relationship between underrepresentation and minority population. And this is robust throughout a number of specifications. We have year fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, and controls. And the other nice feature of a quadratic specification is that it allows us to estimate quite easily the maximum extent of underrepresentation and the location of this maximum, right? So the second panel shows you these estimates, and we can see that the maximum underrepresentation varies from 20 to 35 percentage points, depending on the specification. And the location is consistently with the picture. The location of these RMAX happens to be between 55 and 60% of minority population share. So here we're establishing empirically and statistically that this underrepresentation we saw in the raw data is significant, and it's robust, and happens to be exactly where minorities are a very sizable share of the population, right? Having established this fact, we wanted to start looking into what's behind this, right? And what could drive this specific shape and this specific underrepresentation. And the first thing that we looked at were electoral rules in US municipalities, meaning how city councils are elected. And among the main things, municipalities can be divided into large systems, citywide multi-member systems of election, as opposed to single-member district, classic first past the post system. And from previous work of Francesco, we know theoretically and empirically how electoral rules can be used strategically to disenfranchise voters, and how electoral rules were used strategically around the passing of the original Voting Rights Act in 1965 to disenfranchise minority voters, right? So at-large systems are very good at diluting the votes of minorities in these citywide big elections, provided that the minorities are not too big and not too large to win an outright majority. And single-member districts are effective at packing and limiting the political influence of minorities as their share grows larger. Right? Probably going to skip this for a second for sake of time, and just going to show you what the two systems compare to each other. So we are adapting our quadratic specification with interactions to account for the two different systems. So we're comparing municipalities that elect a majority of seats at large to municipalities that elect the majority of seats, council seats by single-member districts. And what we find is that some single-member districts do perform somewhat better in terms of our maximum underrepresentation estimate. So they show lower maximum underrepresentation, and the difference between the two systems is statistically significant. However, both systems still display quite a sizable underrepresentation, right? So single-member districts do perform somewhat better, but both of them are still show quite extensive underrepresentation. And this is somewhat in line, but also in contrast with the way that especially the political science literature has been looking at the single-member districts. They've been seen as somewhat favorably in the sense that by packing minorities in specific districts, they do allow some extent of representation. Right? They do allow minorities to elect some candidates. But what our results are also showing is that yes, they do allow some representation, but also they're not good enough to solve underrepresentation outright. Right? So they're good in one sense, but also not not good enough in the end. And next we show, we look at whether or not these the electoral rules are chosen strategically, right? So we saw the comparison between the two systems, but are they chosen depending on the municipalities and depending on the size of the minority strategically to disenfranchise them, right? So here we're still adopting a quadratic specification in the sense that we're regressing on minority and minority squared in the population, but our dependent variable here is the size, the share of seats in the city councils that are elected at large. And what these results are telling us is that the share of seats elected at large, again, displays this quadratic and concave relationship, meaning that it grows up to a certain point. So more seats are elected at large when minority share increases in the municipality. And then at some point it starts decreasing. And where it stops increasing and starts decreasing, the argmax is between 25 and 30% of the population share. Meaning that at large systems are chosen more and more in municipalities with a relatively low minority share. And this is precisely the point at which at large systems are very good at diluting the vote of minorities in at large elections, in citywide elections. And then as the minority grows big enough to potentially be threatening in an at large election, then single member districts come into play, and they do what they do, which is pack and limit the vote of minorities in specific districts and prevent them to win an at-large election. And this is also consistent with the previous results of Francesco's paper and what was happening in the 60s and still happening in our data set, which is 50 years later. We do find similar patterns of under-registration using our registration data, very much consistent with underrepresentation, somewhat not to the same extent, but consistent in shape and location. But really, I wanted to take a little bit longer to talk about the Shelby ruling and the results we find for the removal of Voting Rights Act protection. So I'm going to try to be brief, maybe 5 minutes. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act requires that all jurisdictions identified with a coverage formula contained in Section 4B must receive a federal approval, which is also known as preclearance, before implementing any change to their voting procedures. And this definition is left very vague and general on purpose to include literally every change to the voting procedures. And the jurisdiction which is proposing these changes has burden of proof in showing that these proposed changes have no effects, nor intent, nor discriminatory intent towards race or language minorities. This coverage formula was based mainly on registration and turnout criteria based on 1964 presidential elections and a number of other criteria, and was updated in 68 and 72. And what happened in 2013 in this Shelby County versus Holder case was that the Supreme Court held the coverage formula, this mathematical formula based on parameters in 1964, unconstitutional. And they argued that it was unconstitutional because it was effectively based on outdated parameters. As I said, they were last updated in 1972, and they were updated. They were outdated, and since 1972, there have been enough progress in terms of representation and voting rights for minorities that, the coverage formula is unconstitutional and effectively no longer needed. The thing is that without the coverage formula, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act no longer applies to any jurisdiction because there's no longer any jurisdiction that is identified as being subject to it. And so effectively, by declaring unconstitutional the coverage formula, they nullified one of the main provisions of the Voting Rights Act. This change gives us the possibility to compare municipalities that were previously covered by the Voting Rights Act to municipalities that were not covered by the Voting Rights Act before and after this change. And we are going to do that by estimating our preferred quadratic specification and comparing the estimated maximum underrepresentations as a way to compare how these curves stack up to each other, and we are going to compare these maxes in a definitive fashion to get at that magnitude of or an effect of removing Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And this is what these curves look like. And so on the left-hand side, we are showing the estimated underrepresentation for non-covered municipalities in the dashed line, and the previously covered municipalities in the solid line. And this is the pre-Shelby period, so before 2013. And what we see is that the Voting Rights Act was working somehow to some extent as intended, meaning that the underrepresentation in municipalities previously covered is lower than municipalities that were never covered. So it was working, and if anything, it wasn't working perfectly. Of course, we don't reach proportionality, and if anything, we might want to consider extending those protections to the non-covered municipalities as well. And on the right-hand side, we have the post-Shelby figure, and what we can see from that is that as soon as the Voting Rights Act protection was removed, non-covered municipalities revert back to never covered underrepresentation levels. Right. So as soon as preclearance was no longer enforced because of the removal of the coverage formula, underrepresentation went up to let's say non-VRA, non-Voting Rights Act level. And if we compare the changes in these maxes, we do get an effect of Shelby of about 6 percentage points in increased underrepresentation for previously covered municipalities. The registration results, as we mentioned at the beginning, is a little bit more technical because the data has some limitations that we address in the paper. So I don't have time to go into the technical details of how we do this. What we do get at is that we show that underrepresentation, registration of white voters of minority voters relative to white voters decreased after Shelby. And what we do find, and it's consistent again with the story of explicit disenfranchisement, intentional disenfranchisement, is that this decline in registration is stronger, and it's really only located in municipalities with minority shares above the median, meaning municipalities with a sizable minority share. And this same decline in registration does not happen in municipalities with minority shares below the median. I mean, in municipalities where the minorities are small enough that are not really sizable in political terms, right? And this is what we find for the registration results. Just to sum up, so we document underrepresentation of minorities in city councils. Minorities are most underrepresented when they account for 55 to 60% of the voting age population. This pattern is consistent with strategic selection of electoral rules, with the pattern of underregistration we documented, and with other institutional features that we don't have time to go into the 15-20 minutes presentation. And finally, that the removal of Voting Rights Act protection in 2013 increased underrepresentation and negatively affected minority registration relative to white in previously covered municipalities. So that was the talk. Thank you.
Excellent, Federico. So I want to ask the audience, the Zoom audience, to whether they have any questions, and I will start by asking you a couple of things, because one thing that seems to be very important and prominent in your work is the claim of intentionality. And so I wonder whether in your potential heterogeneity analysis, whether you see, which type of municipalities, which type of political context are those where the intentionality is the clearest, and what is the objective function after all, if it's just race and ethnicity protection or correspond to other correlated objectives. maybe you want to collect.
Yeah,
some
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever. I guess we can go for this one. And then, yeah. No, that's a very interesting question. Very interesting point. We do observe in the Shelby analysis, we do observe the similar, let's say, concave relationship, meaning this curve of underrepresentation. We do observe the curve decreases and somewhat flattens, increases and peaks at similar location of minority share, meaning that following the removal of Shelby, underrepresentation increases throughout, but is particularly biting for municipalities that have a minority share of again around 50 to 60%, meaning those municipalities where minority shares are big enough to challenge an electoral rule. In terms of specific institutional changes, we are somewhat limited by what the ICMA service provides us, in the sense that we can look at electoral rules. That's really probably, based on what we've seen in the results in our paper, that's the most important factor that we can observe, and the one that is relatively easier to change for municipalities. We cannot really observe. We do observe some changes in formal government, but it's probably a much harder and much more complicated reform to implement. That it doesn't really happen that often in the data. But I also think that there's a number of changes that we unfortunately cannot observe given the data we have at our disposal at the moment. In particular, I would expect changes in terms of redistricting at the local level. So we know absolutely nothing about gerrymandering, or even just without going into gerrymandering, just the shapes of districts, of city council districts in US municipalities, right? There's and that is something that we can observe. And if we look at what kind of preclearance submissions were made when Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was still in place, we do see that a lot of that is about redistricting. So municipalities were asking to change the shape of the districts. A lot of that is about polling places, locations, so where to position the stations, and timing, hours of operation. So there's a lot of more nuanced details that we don't observe in the ICMA data that probably go to explain this effect of removing Shelby protection on for underrepresentation. So there's a lot more nuanced changes underneath that it will be very interesting to get to study at some point.
Yeah. Excellent. Anybody else?
I don't know if Francesco wants to add something, or if there are more questions.
Yeah, no, I would say just in terms of big picture, I think an important feature of what we're showing is that when you're looking at essentially targeting of minorities, it actually, the theory really helps you in basically, instead of looking just as average effects, you should be looking where actually these minorities are electorally important and strategically important, and that's where they are like big enough, that's where they have enough of an opportunity of change in things. Instead of looking at just average conditional means, you should be looking at the heterogeneity really, because it really matters, and you won't see anything on for the most part on average, but you will see that where it matters, registration rates are abnormally lower, electoral rules are different, and so on and so forth. So that kind of, I think, maybe is the takeaway. By looking at these non-linearities, you really kind of have a sense that the theory is informing the way you should look at these pictures, because they do kind of conform with what we think the political economy incentives would be. And this is a little bit ignored in this discussion of the Supreme Court, or the, you know, in the law discussion on this. And I think that's where political economy really helps, and economics in general really helps.
I would have a question on this heterogeneity, in fact. So I suppose that these places that have a very large share of migrants differ also, or minorities differ also on a lot of other dimensions, right? So they will have economic, socio-demographic features that come along with this minority share. So,
well, think about it in terms of California, where you have large changes within municipality over time, and that's where the municipality fixed effects really help.
Of course, the thing that I was wondering more on from a theoretical perspective, so I was wondering, what are other margins along which the disenfranchising of minorities can happen, right? So I would think in these first past the post systems, residential segregation might help, to really concentrate minorities in certain districts, and then, get sort of underrepresentation through that. So I was wondering whether you see differences in sort of the margins along which this disenfranchisement can happen that go beyond these electoral rules and can happen sort of in different kinds of, social policies that may be at the disposal of these local governments and institutions.
Yeah, segregation is definitely something that we asked ourselves about at some point. I guess we didn't decide to focus on that. We don't have results on segregation in the paper explicitly. To some extent, there was already enough in the paper that going into the segregation discussion was just going to be a little bit too much. But there's also another thing that really limits how much we can discuss segregation for these results for municipal elections, which is that we don't know the shape of these districts, right? We do not observe what the single member district look like. So to some extent, you could look at, and really what segregation would matter in these cases would be how easy it would be to design, to draw the districts in such a way that you can pack and limit the minorities, right? So in that sense, I guess it would be interesting to look at segregation at a local level and go as local as possible, like having really the pieces of the puzzles as small as possible, and somehow find a way to measure how easy it would be to gerrymander a municipal district in a given municipality. But without knowing the shape of the district is very hard and also very computationally intensive. Once you have race or ethnicity data at the block level to find a way or an index or some sort of measure that tells you how easy it would be to gerrymander that specific municipality. So it's very interesting. It's quite a lot of work to get at how segregation would matter in this case without having the maps of these districts, which would be great to have.
There is also something a little bit deeper, I think, to what Sulin's asked, which is basically you have access to a vector of things that you can use to disenfranchise these minorities. It's not completely clear these are complements or substitutes. I mean, they may work well together depending on the situation. So as Federico correctly stated, our analysis tries to get a subset of very important ones, registration of voters, electoral rules, forms of government. But yeah, we're leaving out a ton. And it's possible that these more subtle things, for instance, like voter IDs plus position of location of polling stations plus, changing rules for the state DMVs, they kind of all achieve this. And then I think it's very good for other people that now see a little bit more of the technique here to enter this literature and maybe try to build on what we're finding in order to present a clear statistical case to these Supreme Court judges and justices and really make a case for this not being a problem that has been solved at all, notwithstanding what the ruling says, this is like a very visible problem, one that has specific features that are problematic for the US democracy. And I would imagine maybe it's happening also elsewhere. So that's all I wanted to add, but thank you.
I have a question. Federico, thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting paper. So is the mechanism, the way to understand it is municipalities are shifting from at-large to single-member districts? So that's one question. Another is, it's interesting that the municipalities that were subject to preclearance basically joined the rest after 2013. And this makes me think that the other municipalities that were probably not in the South, so these are in the North and in the Midwest, and places that when we tend to think of US geography, we think that these are very progressive places. They don't have an issue with minorities voting in the same way that the South does. So is that sort of the right way to think about it? And also, I was just curious how or whether there's any details about the mechanism for the underregistration, how that happens. But overall, I just want to say thank you. It's such a really interesting paper.
Thank you so much. So in terms of electoral rules, it's both, right? It's not just a one-way change from single-member district to at large. It really depends, like what our result on the choice of electoral rule, it really shows that it depends on the size of the minority. So when the minority is small, then at-large systems are more likely to be chosen, and that's robust also with municipality fixed effects. So those are changes. But, as the municipality is relatively smaller, then at-large systems are usually preferred because they allow to just dilute the vote in a large election and basically prevent minorities to elect any candidate. But as the minority increases and goes past this threshold of 25 to 30%, which is not a random threshold in the sense that city council districts are usually on average 6 seats, meaning that if a municipality accounts for 25 to 30% of the population, that's precisely when they are big enough. You can limit them in one district, conceding, let's say, one district to the minority and keeping the rest of the council and keeping the majority of the council. So it really depends on the size of the minority and whether the minority is growing or shrinking, and then you will see changes in the electoral rule. And for the second part about how like what's behind the fact that it goes back to the same level. Yeah, I mean, what we get from that result is really that if anything, the Voting Rights Act protection, especially the section 5 and this preclearance system, might have been a good idea to extend it to other municipalities, because it really matters, especially for municipalities with big minority shares. It really matters, and we do see the same underrepresentation levels in both groups. And not only that, but to some extent, I do think that the Shelby ruling could have been seen from all municipalities, not just previously covered, as a clear signal that voting rights were no longer like a crucial element that courts would consider when judging on voting cases, right? So if previously never covered municipalities saw Shelby as an indicator that the enforcement of voting rights was no longer a priority for the courts, then we do see this realignment towards underrepresentation in all groups. And I think in that sense, Shelby was section 5 was particularly effective in the sense that not only left the burden of proof on the covered municipality, but it also gave a very easy legal cause, just cause to sue municipalities or any jurisdiction for voting changes if they just didn't ask for the preclearance. So even before going into analyze whether the change was discriminatory or not, any group, private citizens or groups, could sue a municipality if they implemented changes without asking for preclearance in a covered jurisdiction. Right? So that was a very easy and let's say low cost legal cost to bring forward a case. Whereas now, it's, you need to have a very solid legal case for how discriminatory it was and why it was it, since Section 5 no longer applied. So, yeah.
I have one last question. Do you have any way to get at the spillovers of this reform on minorities underrepresentation outside politics? Because you might think that if of course it's important in its own right that minority underrepresentation in politics goes back to pre-period, and as if like all the progress of the Voting Rights Act has been dissolved. But it would be interesting if there are spillovers, right? If it's the society of that district that then starts getting less inclusive at all levels, firms, corporations, public schools.
That's interesting. We don't have anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, we don't. But it's a really, really interesting point. Yeah, especially for whatever is in the hands of the city council to change and to choose, right? So I would expect like public employments at the local level, maybe you could start to see some of those effects as well. Yeah, it's a really, really good point.
So can I ask another question? So I think Francesco said earlier that it's interesting that theory guides your investigation and predictions, in the sense that without it and people just looking at bins, they say, well, it doesn't matter, so why should we worry? And so my question is, have people actually used the argument, these changes, this kind of this judicial change hasn't made any difference, so we shouldn't worry and everything is fine?
I mean, this is what if you read the Shelby ruling, that's exactly what they're saying. This is a problem. And there was a minority opinion, a dissenting opinion, saying essentially this is not true. But I think what's more worrisome is not only there wasn't any theoretical discussion, okay, of course, but not even looking at the basic data. There was no reference to empirical evidence on a systematic level when this was at least as far as I can see, and given the references in the ruling. So to me, these are worrisome things. But going back to the theory, where is the theory important? The theory tells you where you should see the effects, essentially, because you won't see this if these rules are costly and potentially damaging to change. So you're going to use those changes surgically. You're not going to see them applied in a blanket way across, certain jurisdictions. You will see them where they matter. And where they matter comes from essentially having a good political economy model that can tell you, that can guide you in that. And so that's, I think that's kind of the lesson that I took from this myself personally.
Thanks. No, but I think this is important, and you should publicize it more. I think it has implications beyond academia.
Well, thank you for giving us this platform. This is one starting point for this.
Yes, I think that your results, but also your motivation should be inspiring for more and more top researchers to get in this. This is particularly problematic for people with disabilities, as I may say this as on the side, because first of all, fortunately, well, I guess that the population of people with disabilities in the profession and outside is a bit smaller than, of course, like prominent minorities like in race and ethnicity. But I think more than the numbers, it has to do with also the difficulties to find contexts in which one can do policy evaluation on a disability reform with well-identified research. So I am, and also like people with disabilities like me tend to get involved in or tend to start getting involved in research on this minority representation problem later in career, right? There is a sort of stigma at the beginning of the career. People of who have a certain trait don't want to work on research on that trait. Maybe because it's perceived as cheap or something, but it's a tendency that I've noticed, and it's something of which I feel guilty of that. I think I should have devoted part of my own research to this topic, maybe as a representation, as a proportional representation within my research areas. So that there should have been space for this, and I hope that the fact that prominent researchers are doing excellent papers on these minority underrepresentation topics will eliminate this kind of shyness to get into this even earlier stages in career. So Federico, you are a good symbol.
Thank you, man.
Okay, Gemma, you want to say something about the general future of this paper award? Or Antonio?
No, it's just that the association has welcomed we were very keen on the creation of the committee, and we love it. I think the council and the executive committee and the assembly are all extremely proud of this work, and we want to just hope that you go from strength to strength. And if you show us examples like this every year, then all the better. That's what we're here for.
Very good. So happy 2023 and productive to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massimo. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco.
Great work.